Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about the relationship between Wicca and the rest of European occultism. Um, the conventional wisdom is that Wicca is very much a part of the sort of Western occult tradition, that it is a child of older occult traditions and things that came before it, and that those got synthesized in a particular way in order to produce Wicca. So, for example, in the coven that I was initiated into, it was very much taught that Wicca was a child of the Golden Dawn. Um, and that various things about Wicca were the way they were because of the Golden Dawn. And increasingly, really, especially over the past 5 years, but increasingly, I've really come to think that that's not the case, or at least that that's not the case for the Wicca that I practice and that I experience, right? Again, Wicca is such a heterogeneous thing. It's very hard to make generalizing statements about Wicca because, ask two covens and you'll get 5 answers. But broadly speaking, I increasingly find that Wicca really is its own thing, that it has a coherent internal structure, that it has a coherent cosmology, and I at least don't find those things in the broader history of Western occultism in quite that way. Um, I think that's enough of a preamble. Let's get into specifics because I think that will help to clarify what I'm talking about. So the overwhelming majority, maybe all, not quite all, the overwhelming majority of occultism in Europe for the past 1,000 years has centered on astrology. Astrology is really the bedrock of European occultism. And when we talk about astrology, there are kind of three main categorizations, three main sort of symbolic divisions that come up. So the first is the 7 planets, right? So the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. I don't do modern astrology, so I don't fuck around with planets that can't be seen with the naked eye. But there are contemporary astrologers who have incorporated things like Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and then various asteroids. But really, for most of the history of Western occultism, we're talking about the 7 planets. And those structure all kinds of things, right? You talk about planetary days, planetary hours. Just in general, the symbolism of the number 7 is kind of inevitably planetary. There are versions of alchemy, there are approaches to alchemy that divide alchemical transmutation into 7 distinct processes, which are associated with the 7 planets. If you read The Alchemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, which I have on my shelf here somewhere, but I can't be bothered to go find it, the wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz is told as a narrative in 7 days, where each of the 7 days corresponds to one of the 7 planets, including, things that are designed in certain colors, and then various thematic things that happen. So on the first day, which is a Saturn day, everyone is in prison and everything is black and decaying and dark, and then you go to the Jupiter day and it's all blue and bright and so on. It's all very, very planetary. It's heavily planetary. If you look at Kabbalah, sort of Golden Dawn style Kabbalah, and then the Christian Kabbalah that precedes it, I'm not going to touch on Jewish Kabbalah because that is very much its own living thing. But if you look at the Kabbalah that was practiced by largely Christian magicians in Europe for roughly the past 1,000 years, heavily planetary. Right? 7 of the 10 Sfirot are associated with the 7 planets. So the planets are a big part of astrology, but they're also really part of the bedrock of Western occultism more broadly. After the planets, you have, of course, the zodiac. Let's try to prevent the cat from brushing up against my microphone. The 12-fold division of the zodiac. We all know the signs of the zodiac, right? The zodiac is a way of measuring space in the sky. It's a way of dividing the ecliptic into 12 equal portions that are named after but not identical to 12 constellations that are visible in the sky. The 12-fold division of the zodiac also just pervasive in our society in ways that we don't often want to admit because we think of ourselves as secular, but the fact that we have 12 months, the fact that the day and night are divided into 12 hours, these are astrological in origin, because they date back to a time when astronomy and astrology were not separate disciplines. And, so much of Western occultism is rooted in the zodiac. Again, thinking about Kabbalah and the Tree of Life, you have the 3 mother letters, you have the 7 double letters, which are the planetary letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and then you have the 12 single letters, which correspond to the signs of the zodiac. The zodiac is a way of measuring time. Any kind of electional astrology, any kind of astrological timing for magic is usually going to involve the zodiac in some way. But then you also have archangels who preside over the zodiac, and so on. And then finally, you have the 4 elements. The 4 elements, pervasive in much of Western occultism. You see them in alchemy, and then sort of within alchemy, you also see sort of a variant on them, which is the sort of mercury and sulfur, which generate the 4 elements. And then under Paracelsus, you get mercury, sulfur, and salt. But the 4 elements are pre-Aristotelian, but really come together with Aristotle. And then through Aristotle in scholastic philosophy, you find they just kind of become a foundation of not just occult philosophy, but philosophy in general, through certainly the medieval period, and then really hiding in the background for much of later philosophy. And we have the 4 elements not just in alchemy. Again, we have them in Kabbalah. We have the 4 elemental worlds. We have the 3 mother letters, which correspond to 3 of the 4 elements. The 4th one isn't really there for complicated reasons. The Golden Dawn kind of throws it in at the end in order to provide a 4-fold division. But then we also have the 4 elements, certainly in the Golden Dawn's interpretation of Enochian magic. It is more questionable whether it's actually in Enochian magic itself. But the 4 elements, obviously present in tarot, they just kind of, they work their way into everything. And so really anything that you look at in European magic has this astrological foundation, right? The spirits that you're conjuring in the grimoires are governed by various planets. Natural magic, homeopathic magic, often has to do with the doctrine of signatures and figuring out which planet rules a particular plant or crystal or whatever. And it's everywhere. And when I look at Wicca, I really don't see that same structure that we find in most of the rest of Western occultism. Now, there are, just before you get typing in the comments, there are people who disagree with me, right? There are very prominent people who disagree with me. So Patricia Crowther, famously, is very much on the astrology gravy train. Patricia Crowther, deeply invested in astrology, absolutely believes that astrology is the heart of Wicca, that you cannot understand Wicca without understanding astrology. She's written various books, including The Zodiac Experience, that talk about astrology as kind of the central way of accessing those mysteries. And I don't mean to dispute her experience, right? I'm sure that her covens through time have worked magic in a deeply astrological way. I know lots of initiates and lots of covens that do astrological magic. that place a heavy emphasis on the 7 planets, that place a heavy emphasis on astrological timing, whatever it may be. But it doesn't make sense to me. And I've talked about this before. I have an older video about Wicca and astrology, which I will try to link up above. Astrology is just a different framework from Wicca. It doesn't fit, right? We have, like, our division of time and space is not 12-fold, it's 8-fold. We have an 8-fold wheel of the year. And yeah, 4 of those Sabbats align with the solstices and equinoxes. They are astronomical, and therefore one could decide that they are astrological. But thematically, what's going on at, the summer solstice in terms of the way that the summer solstice has always been celebrated in my coven, or the way that I have seen or heard other initiates talking about it, overwhelmingly, the symbolism that people are choosing to explore does not have to do with the sun's ingress into Cancer. It's just a different thing. People are celebrating sort of the light being at its peak. They're celebrating the arrival of summer. They're celebrating sort of life coming into bloom, right? The summer solstice is, in some senses, people think of it as midsummer because it's the point when light is at its greatest. But in other senses, summer is really just getting started. And we're still looking forward to the heat of July and August. Those are the things that people are exploring in their Sabbat rituals. It's not the sun's ingress into Cancer, which would be a very different kind of symbolism, a very different sort of way of structuring ritual. And so, I mean, like, we don't, there's nothing zodiacal about the way that Wicca works, except, like, if you really wanted to push it, you could say that people do espats on the full moons, which not everyone does, but, like, theoretically at least, people do espats on the full moons, and there are 12 full moons in the year, and they correspond to the moon in each of the 12 signs, which is great in theory, except that Wicca has this idea, which astronomically doesn't work, but there is this idea in Wicca that there are 13 full moons in a year. And there are 13 espats, right? There's a poem by Doreen Valiente called The Witch's Creed, where she says, 13 silver moons in the year are, 13 is the coven's array. 13 times at espat make merry, for each golden year in a day. That's not zodiacal. That is not the 12-fold zodiac. That is a different thing. Largely, honestly, inspired by Robert Graves and his made-up tree calendar. So, like, it just doesn't fit. Same thing with the planets. Excuse me. We don't have 7 planets in Wicca. Wiccan, like, and again, like, there are people who do. There are people who work very closely with planetary energies. There are people who pay attention to planetary transits when they are timing their rituals or deciding what magic they're going to do or thinking about initiating someone. And that's legit. I do not mean to suggest that that's not legit. But I think that if you just kind of look at the bones of Wicca, the basics of what this framework is, we have a moon goddess. She's not the same as the astrological moon, right? There's a lot going on with the moon goddess that you don't really find in the moon in astrology. In particular, she has certain characteristics that you might associate with Venus in astrology, or that you might associate with Saturn in astrology. We have a god who is sometimes depicted as a solar god, sort of as a complement to the moon goddess. Not everyone depicts him that way, so, like, gotta be careful there. But, like, he really has very little to do with the astrological sun. Like, he's the god of death, and that's not the sun in astrology. It's not what the sun is about. So, insofar as we do have celestial bodies that play an important role in Wicca, the role they play is very different from the role that those same celestial bodies play in an astrological framework. And, like, unless you're making a conscious choice to be an astrologically inclined coven, there's nothing in Wicca that says you have to pay attention to when Mars goes retrograde. It's not a part of the framework, because the framework of Wicca, at least as I understand it, again, like I don't mean to be telling other people what they can and can't do. And if you're doing astrology as a part of your Wicca, that's great. But just, from where I stand, Wicca is about the push and pull of life and death, and the eternal cycle of life and death, the ebb and flow of that particular tide. And what's going on in astrology is a much more elaborate clockwork that we just don't see. There is no sort of isomorphic translation from here to there. The place in which you see sort of the closest to the influence of this astrological undergirding that we find in the whole of Western occultism is with the four elements, right? The overwhelming majority of Wiccan covens or individual Wiccan practitioners work very closely with the four elements. That's a thing that probably comes into Wicca via Doreen Valiente. If you read Gerald Gardner's own books, he actually pretty explicitly disavows elemental magic. He says, like, oh, that's stuff that the sorcerers, the high magicians who aren't witches, like, they work with elementals, and we the witches don't do that. Which, I mean, no one bothers to read Gerald Gardner, and also realistically no one should bother to read Gerald Gardner because he's a terrible writer. But if you have the context of initiation, and you understand the things that you're looking for in Gerald, you can comb through and skip over the stuff about how there were hot air balloons in ancient Mesopotamia, which is a thing that he says, and it's insane. And you can there are interesting tidbits that can shed a certain amount of light on history in the early days of Wicca. So, it is overwhelmingly true that most Wiccans work very closely with the four elements. And in that sense, there is something of the greater European occult tradition that appears in Wicca. But the four elements in the greater European occult tradition aren't a standalone thing. They are part of this astrological framework. The reason that the four elements are as big as they are in Western magic is because they are a part of astrology, and astrology is as big as it is in Western magic. And you don't really find, until Wicca, you don't really find magic that is using those four elements that is absent a planetary and zodiacal framework as well. That's something that really only crops up in Wicca. I'm sure there are exceptions. Someone's going to call me out in a comment. That's fine. But broadly speaking, right, like alchemy, you have the four elements, you also have the planetary and zodiacal stuff. Kabbalah, you have the four elements, you also have the planetary and the zodiacal stuff. Solomonic magic really doesn't have the four elements. Solomonic magic has there's a little bit. There's a mention in a chapter of some of the grimoires that says something about sort of earthly and aerial spirits and the natures of them and why they're easier to command. But it's kind of it. The focus of Solomonic magic is overwhelmingly planetary and zodiacal. And so when we look at, I don't know, where Wicca fits into the framework of European magic as a whole, I feel like Wicca really is very different, more different than a lot of people recognize from the overwhelming majority of the history of Western occultism. Again, I came up in a coven that took it for granted that Wicca was a child of the Golden Dawn. And if you read my first book, if you look at Kabbalah for Wiccans, you see that assumption present in that book, right? You see, oh, well, Wicca comes from the Golden Dawn, and therefore these various sort of Kabbalistic or planetary things that are present in the Golden Dawn are also implicitly present in Wicca, and we just need to bring them to the fore. That was kind of the attitude that I had when I wrote that book. And that is no longer my attitude. I still think it's a good book. I think that learning Kabbalah, if you want to learn it, as a lens through which to view Wicca will be very enriching. But, oh my goodness, my computer has gone to sleep. I don't think that Kabbalah is implicitly present in Wicca because Wicca comes out of this history of Western occultism the way that I thought when I wrote that book. In fact, I don't think that Kabbalah is implicitly present in Wicca. I don't think that alchemy is implicitly present in Wicca. I don't think that astrology is implicitly present in Wicca. There are elements of Western occultism that are implicitly present in Wicca. The Solomonic tradition is there to an extent. Wicca is very different in key ways from the Solomonic tradition, but you see inspiration and influence there. There is some Aleister Crowley present in Wicca to a certain extent. I think that influence is much more superficial than people sometimes want to believe, and I have a previous video about that. But like, there is some Aleister Crowley. We know that Gardner was reading Crowley. We know that he liked Crowley's poetry. We know that when Doreen was initiated, she was annoyed by how inspired Gardner was by a lot of Crowley's poetry because she didn't feel that the tone of the Crowleyana was appropriate for like a low magic witchcraft religion. So there's, those things are present. There's a strong influence from spiritualism in Wicca, and I think like I have increasingly come to view spiritualism as one of the biggest influences on the early days of Wicca. I think the more that you understand spiritualism, the more that you understand Wicca. But then a lot of the big influences on Wicca, from my point of view, my argument, which not everyone will agree with, there is room for reasonable debate about this, but I really see a lot of Wicca coming out of ideas about witchcraft and paganism that were current in scholarship and in the sort of cultural zeitgeist at the time that Wicca formed. So, I'm a slut for the Golden Bough. I think that James Frazer is one of the biggest influences on the Gardnerian tradition. I've said it before, I've said it again. To have understood the Golden Bough is to have understood Wicca. I think Margaret Murray, right, like overwhelmingly important. Margaret Murray is so much more present in Wicca than alchemy is, or than Kabbalah is, or any sort of Enochian magic, whatever, like the Golden Dawn, any of that. There's more Margaret Murray in Wicca than there is in those things. Now, again, that's not to say that those things can't be brought into Wicca, because they can, and lots of people have. But you will find lots of covens that do Golden Dawn-inspired magic, and lots of covens that don't do Golden Dawn-inspired magic. You will not find any covens where you can't see the influence of Margaret Murray, and I think that's the point that I'm trying to make. You will find covens where you can see the influence of the Golden Dawn, astrology, Enochian magic, Kabbalah, alchemy, Cornelius Agrippa, whatever you want to. You will find covens that are doing that. You will find covens that are doing the Abramelin ritual. Great. You will also find covens that are not doing all of that. And the things that I think are more appropriately identified as major influences on Wicca are the things where you would be really hard-pressed to find a coven in initiatory Wicca where there was not a visible influence from Margaret Murray, where there was not a visible influence from James Frazer, where there was not a visible influence from Victorian spiritualism, from the Solomonic tradition, like from Robert Graves. I hate to admit that because he's terrible, but yeah, I mean, you would be hard-pressed to find a coven where there isn't at least some influence in the background from Robert Graves. Those are the things that, to my eye, are the context for Wicca, are the influences, are the background that allows Wicca to be what it is. And then you also have like romantic poetry and all the stuff that Ronald Hutton really likes to talk about. Hutton is much more of a romanticism enthusiast than I am, so he will really emphasize like Swinburne and maybe Keats. Like he'll really emphasize the poetic inspirations for Wicca. I don't focus on that as much, but that's definitely there, right? But I think those things were like, wow, it would be really hard to find a coven that didn't have visible influence from this. That's what we should be talking about when we talk about like where Wicca fits into a broader context. And I think that for the most part, what we think of as European occultism, what we think of as like the Western mystery tradition, doesn't apply to Wicca in that way. Because while there are certainly covens that do some of it, you're not going to find that ubiquity. And again, to me, it really all comes back to astrology. Because I think that anywhere else in Western occultism, you cannot escape astrology. And in Wicca, you can. And I find that telling. So that's all I have for today. I'm going to go take care of some errands for the day. But thank you for listening. I'll talk to you sometime soon. Bye.